Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next lesson on Elizabeth and her reign. So, this lesson, we are going to be looking at the difficulty she had with being a female ruler. And we kind of touched on this last lesson when we were looking at her childhood, and the fact that she was a woman meant that nobody at the time of the birth had any idea that she could possibly end up being a ruling queen. So remember, England had a history of not having female rulers. The one time they tried, it didn't go so well. So Elizabeth is sort of following in the footsteps of her older sister Mary, who is the first sort of proper ruling queen that England had. So it was a really new idea. So by the end of the lesson, you can understand attitudes towards female rulers at the time and understand the difficulties that they face, in particular around marriage. So who they are going to marry. So just a brief overview of Tudor attitudes to women in general, and as we could probably all guess, they are not brilliant. So the church taught that women should obey their husbands. So from a young age, both men and women were taught women are supposed to do what their husbands tell them to. So husbands take the lead. The law said that women were the property of their husbands. There's actually a bit in the Church of England marriage service where the vicar says, who gives this woman? And that's when the woman's father steps up and is like, I do, and then sort of gives her symbolically to the groom. So women were the property of their fathers until they marry, where they're transferred into being the property of their husbands. And Tudor society is really clear on the idea of what a good woman is. So gentle, quiet, not argumentative, obedient, does as she's told, sweet and loving. So we will look at the impact that it has on the Queen, but there are some advantages to marrying when you're a ruling queen, which we do need to look at. And the first one is the really big one. So having a male heir. So having a son that can take over the throne when you die. So heir is just someone who inherits the throne. So for Elizabeth, next in line for the throne was her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. So Elizabeth's sister, her older sister Mary the First, that's Mary the First of England. She dies without having a son. That's how Elizabeth gets the throne. If Elizabeth dies without having a son, it will go to her cousin, another Mary, this time from Scotland. And we're going to meet Mary, Queen of Scots, a couple of times in our story. That really, though, is the main one. Other than that, husband could lead an army into war. It could create an alliance with a noble family, or if they're from abroad, with a foreign country. However, just as easily, though, you can cause resentment with every noble family you don't pick a husband from. So actually, the advantages are very few. And if you don't care about having a son to inherit after you, you are far better off not getting married, as we're going to see in our story. So, problems for a ruling queen. Will their husbands expect them to obey? And the answer is going to be, yeah, these are people who have been conditioned from birth that husbands rule, wives obey. But how do you do that if you've got a ruling queen? So you're the husband who expects to obey, but you're a queen who expects to be obeyed. There's that danger if you're a ruling queen, will they act as a king and then have more power than you? Worth noting, this is a problem for ruling queens right the way up to modern day. So Queen Victoria in the 1800s had a very similar issue with her husband Albert, feeling his role as sort of head of the household had disappeared. Even the last queen we had, Elizabeth II, so sort of 1950s onwards, her husband felt very much like he was not head of the family. So if relatively modern men are feeling like this, you can imagine how a Tudor man's going to feel. But even if you put that idea to a side, you're like, maybe I'll just obey my husband. Maybe it'd be quite good to have someone who will act as a king to help share like the workload, the pressure. Who are you going to marry? So the two options there, and we'll look in more detail in a couple of slides about the impact of this. Someone from your own country. So in the case of Elizabeth, an English lord, there were a lot of powerful families. But then you run the risk that all the other lords that aren't chosen are going to feel jealous or resentful, especially as your chosen husband most likely knows all the other lords. They've grown up together, they spend time at court together. You're going to pick one out of the whole group and make him more important than everyone else. That is going to lead to jealousy. Or your other option is to go to someone from another country. But the danger there, they're a foreign prince. They might treat England as less important than their own country. So they might put England's interests second. Also worth noting the problems that exist from Elizabeth's childhood. So if you've looked through the last lesson that I did on her childhood, you will know just how traumatic that childhood was for her. And also how much that trauma centers around marriage and women having bad experiences in marriage. So Henry VIII, married 6 times, murdered 2 of his wives, divorced 2. So Elizabeth sort of grew up with the later stepmothers. She was old enough when Catherine Howard was executed to know that that's what happened to her own mother. Also, her older sister, Mary, had married a man called Philip II of Spain, and their marriage was a bit of a disaster. So it made Mary very unhappy. So Elizabeth has lots of examples of women who are married being made unhappy by their husbands. Also, something we kind of forget and we sort of take for granted, childbirth was really risky. So for Tudor women, the kind of, oh, well, you get married and you have sons, it was not that simple. It was you get married and potentially have sons, but there is a really good chance you are going to die in childbirth. 1 in 3 women die from childbirth at this time. Shocking. Thank goodness for modern medicine, including 2 of her stepmothers. So Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour. So she was the mother of Elizabeth's half brother, Edward. She died giving birth to Edward. So Elizabeth would have been very aware that her little brother didn't have his mother because she died in childbirth. But also Henry VIII's last wife, Catherine Parr, after Henry VIII dies, she remarries and she dies in childbirth as well. So Elizabeth is going to be very aware marriage and childbirth is not plain sailing for women. So here are some examples of ruling queens at the time who tried to get married. And the lady on the left there is Mary, Queen of Scots. So Elizabeth's cousin. They're roughly the same age. They're both young. They're both beautiful. They're both ruling queens. And so they get compared an awful lot. So Mary, Queen of Scots, she comes back to Scotland as their queen. She's a widow. She's got married very young. Her husband's died. And she comes back and she's choosing another husband. And she picks the guy in the middle, who is a Scottish lord. So his name is Darnley. So she picks a lord from her own country. The marriage is absolutely disastrous. They end up kind of separated. The other lords resent him to the point that Darnley actually gets murdered for a lot of reasons, some of which are sort of his behaviour, but also that kind of jealousy that he's married to the Queen. When that husband dies, she marries the gentleman on the right. His name is Bothwell. He's another Scottish lord, and again, the same thing happens. Every other Scottish lord gets really resentful that this man that used to be one of them now suddenly has all this power. So Mary, Queen of Scots, great example why choosing a husband from your own country isn't a great idea. And there we have Elizabeth's sister. So it's another Mary. So this is Mary of England. Mary is the first. So she chose a husband from abroad. So that gentleman there is Philip, who we were talking about earlier. Philip II of Spain. And just like we suggested, Philip cared about Spain far more than England. So he didn't spend a lot of time in England. England was very much an afterthought, that kind of problem of marrying someone abroad. So those are the sort of the two kind of contemporary ruling queens of Elizabeth. Both have got married. It's not going well. So what Elizabeth does, she decided to just remain unmarried, that she wasn't going to risk it. So we're not sure when she made this decision, because it was kind of useful to give foreign princes the impression she might marry them to gain their support. And she did a lot of this about, like, let's make an alliance and maybe at the end of it there'll be a marriage. And it really shows up how much power it was assumed her husband would have. So Elizabeth has lots going for her. She's intelligent, she's beautiful, she's charming. But in Tudor marriages, all that's kind of a bonus. What's really important is power and status. And lots of men at this time want to marry Elizabeth because they know being the husband of a queen will give them power and status. So in later years, she announced she was married to England. She was like, this is my country. This is all the love I need. She may have decided this privately much earlier. We don't know. We have no way of knowing which way it went, but certainly would be understandable if she was not prepared to get married, given all the issues that are involved. Okay, so we're going to look now at some of the suitors she had. So some of the men she sort of suggested she might marry in the hope of an alliance. So here we have this gentleman. If you're thinking to yourself, he looks a lot like her sister's husband. That's because it is her sister's husband. So Philip II of Spain, his wife Mary I of England dies. He starts proposing marriage to her younger sister. So they met when he was married to Mary. She was his sister-in-law. She was at court. He was apparently very taken with her, thought she was very charming. But he would like to quite keep hold of England. He's not ready to give it up. So he has some things going for him. He is very rich. He's very powerful. He's King of Spain. However, he is Catholic. And we'll look at religion in a bit, but Elizabeth is Protestant. So marrying a Catholic is a problem. It was unusual for people to marry someone of a different religion. If they did, though, the wives were expected to take the husband's religion. So he's Catholic. And his marriage to Mary I was not successful. Lots of English lords were unhappy with it. Potentially, he could have been a lot more trouble than he was actually worth. Another really famous one, this is Francis, Duke of Anjou. So he's a French prince, he's heir to the French throne. Again, he's Catholic. But there is a suggestion at this time Protestantism is England and some of the Germanic states. So actually, if Elizabeth wants a Protestant husband, she's got very few choices. And at the time that France is in the picture, Elizabeth was 46, which by Tudor standards was very much past the age of having children. So there was a kind of feeling of if you get married to him, what are you going to get out of it? So you're not going to get a son. What other real advantage is there? Especially when you weigh up the risk that Elizabeth dies and then Francis takes over. Does England end up becoming part of France? It could all be a bit messy. And then the last one, very famously, this is Robert Dudley. So he's an English lord. He's from a very powerful family, and he's a childhood friend of Elizabeth. And now this is important because let's remember her childhood. She did not have a stable time. She didn't have many people sort of in her corner, giving her good advice, looking out for her. So the childhood friends who were there for her, who supported her, like Dudley, she must have felt an enormous link to, a loyalty to, a real connection with. So he's from a powerful English family. Slight problem for most of the time is he's actually married. So Robert Dudley has already got married. He leaves his poor wife behind while he goes to court and flirts outrageously with Elizabeth, who is absolutely encouraging him. And lots of people suggest that Dudley would have happily married the Queen if only his wife had died. And then, sadly for his poor wife, she dies in the most suspicious circumstances. So officially, she falls down the stairs and breaks her neck. However, the stairs were very shallow, her headdress wasn't disrupted. There was a lot that was like, it looks a little bit like the poor lady was murdered to get her out of the way of Dudley. So it causes a huge scandal. Dudley's accused of like murdering his wife in order to marry the Queen, and that relationship sort of has to fizzle out just for Elizabeth's reputation. She can't be associated with it. So how might this come up in your exam? So if you're doing the Edexcel course, this really lends itself to a nice 12 mark why question. Why did Elizabeth choose not to marry? Could also be a 16 mark how far do you agree question. So the main reason Elizabeth chose not to marry was childhood trauma. How far do you agree? AQA, this very much lends itself to an interpretation. So one historian's interpretation of why Elizabeth didn't marry. So maybe they're saying like she didn't want to lose power, and then you would bring in your other suggestions.